So now that we kind of, our first webinar was covering kind of just the basics and understanding, the history of maple syrup production, understanding the identification of what trees we can tap, and then that sap flow. And now we really want to get into the meat of things of thinking about actually tapping our maple trees and collecting sap. So that's going to be kind of our next step for tonight, is thinking about that tapping and sap collection. And so um, there's different goals that we have when it comes to actually collecting sap. And the first one is to kind of maximize production from the tree that we have. And so if we can get the most amount of sap per tree is the most ideal. And then the second step is thinking about efficiently transporting that sap to our storage tank. So doing that in the most efficient way possible. So collecting that and then preserving that sap so it doesn't spoil. So we'll talk about that a little bit tonight as well. And then, overall, we want to think about minimizing the labor requirements to do each of these different steps for collecting sap. And so if we think about, first start talking about actually tapping the trees, and then we'll talk about different collection methods and storage. And so when it comes to tapping, overall, it is a pretty basic concept. With that being said, though, it's a really important concept, and it is something that can easily be messed up. And if you don't do it properly, that will impact production. So, the basics of all you need is a drill with a drill bit, and something lightweight kind of hammer that you can tap that spout into a tree. And so that is really basic, and that sounds like that's all you need to do. But as we'll go over, there's some really important concepts that you need to think about, because if you don't tap that tree correctly, you may not get any sap from that, or you could cause damage to the tree or impact the tapping in future years. So there's a lot of different things, and this is really this is the most important step in maple production, is tapping those trees properly. You can have lots of beautiful equipment in your sugar camp for boiling down that sap on a nice fancy evaporator. You could have a great tubing system or all kinds of nice buckets and some kind of machine for going and collecting that sap. But if you don't tap it properly, you don't get any sap. None of that equipment matters at all. So it's all about harvesting that sap correctly, and so tapping correctly. And so one of the first things to start out with is thinking about what we use for actually drilling into the tree, the bit. And so, one option is to go to your toolbox and reach in and find kind of the correct size bit that you may have in that toolbox, whether it's rusty or not, or brand new. And so traditionally, we use in the industry a 5/16 inch drill bit. Depending on, used to be some bucket taps, and I'll show some of those are 7/16. That was the older industry standard. But now most of your spouts that you'll find, even for buckets, sometimes are 5/16 in diameter. And there are different sizes, as I'll show. There's 1/4 inch and I think it's 9/64. Even that spouts that are out there. So there's different sizes, but the industry standard right now is mostly 5/16 of an inch. But what I wanted to put up here is that there are differences between the $20 tapping bit that you can find from a maple supply company versus the just standard $5 bit that you'd get at Lowe's or whatever hardware store, whatever you have around you. Canadian Tire, I think, right? That's your big store there. And so, or just what you have in your toolbox. And so the standard drill bit on the left-hand side, as you notice, it's a little bit more blunt. Our tapping bits have a little bit better point that helps us to set a spot on the tree so the drill bit doesn't wobble at all. And another big difference is the cutting edge on this bit is much sharper all the way down than what it typically is in your standard drill bit, that are made for maybe cutting through metal, so they're more durable, where this is cutting through wood. But our sugar maples or red maples are very hardwood, but it can hold up to that. It can cut really well. And then the spacing between the cutting face is a lot wider. That allows the shavings to get out a lot better. So we want to try to evacuate as many shavings or all the shavings out of the tap hole so that doesn't plug up any of our spouts. And so these are designed to work a little bit better. That being said, I know some of you had indicated last time you're looking at maybe only tapping 10 trees. And so maybe it's not worth you going out and buying a $20 tapping bit. The $3, $5 one, or what you have at your house, it will work. These just give you a little bit cleaner hole. For those of you who are looking to tap the 1,000 trees, I would recommend getting the tapping bit. But on a smaller scale, and you're not really concerned maybe about maximizing production as much, the standard drill bit will work. But if you're doing a lot of tapping, the tapping bit is worth it. These will last for quite a while, usually depending on the type you get. Some are a little bit better than others, but generally I figure that I'm usually getting about 1,000 to 2,000 tap holes out of one bit. They'll eventually, you'll notice that they will get more dull. They won't cut as quickly. They won't evacuate the shavings as well. And then sometimes they can break off in the tree, especially if they've been used a lot as they get duller. So usually I'm good for about 1,000 to 2,000 taps in a tree with one of those bits. So thinking about how we're going to tap. So some of the basic principles first is to make sure that we have a firm grip. So we want to make sure that we're holding on to the drill. Typically, I recommend using both hands. We don't want that drill to wobble around. We want to make sure we drill a nice round hole. If that drill bit wobbles around, you're going to create a oval shaped hole, and that is not going to allow the spout to seal in the tree. And so sap can leak around the outside of that tap hole and not come out through your spout. Or if you're using tubing and vacuum system, as we'll talk about later, that is going to be a point of vacuum leak. So you want to make sure you have a firm grip onto that drill, that you're going holding onto that tight. You have a good footing on the ground. You're not on a slippery log or something that you might slip while you're drilling in, and that's going to make that hole kind of oval shaped. And you also usually want to make sure you're not way above your head, with one hand trying to reach way up, and where you're going to potentially pull down on that because you're reaching up on your tippity toes. So in a spot where you can easily reach with both hands, you're going to drill straight in and straight out. I put a slight angle here as kind of a question mark. So we typically want kind of the industry, old standard was to make sure that you have a slight angle so that the tip of the bit is facing up a little bit with the drill down, so that any of the sap in that tap hole would collect and kind of slide out, or would come out through gravity. That being said, it really doesn't make much of a difference. There's no research that's shown that that's better or not. The biggest thing is making sure you just have a nice, clean, straight in hole. So a little bit of an angle is okay, 5-10% slope on that. We don't want to have the drill higher and the bit lower. We don't want to facing kind of sloping back in where it wouldn't drain out and sap would pool up more. That's less desirable. So slight angle if you want, or just straight in. Don't worry about it too much. And then we want to go in at about 2 inches deep, and I'll show you some more on that in a bit. What we do want to do, make sure, is that we're also avoiding any seams or cracks, that are any scars that you have within here, such as on the right, this big seam going down. We wouldn't want to tap in that area. We probably won't get any sap, or we have this scar here from a sugar maple borer, most likely. We wouldn't want to tap in that area. So any disease, any injured areas, any open bark, or any what looks like dead wood, we want to make sure we avoid that. Making sure we're avoiding old tap holes. I'll show some more pictures on that in a bit. We want to make sure we're avoiding any hollow spots. So if you know the tree has a cavity in a certain area, sometimes you can see that, making sure, you can still tap a hollow tree. That can be okay, as long as there's enough, a couple inches of good sapwood that we're tapping into. You don't want to drill all the way past that into the hollow spot of the tree. That's not going to be good for the tree, but also is not going to be good for your sap flow. So avoiding those hollow areas, and making sure you got a couple inches of wood to be tapping into. So as I mentioned, avoiding these old tap holes. And so obviously we wouldn't want to drill into an old tap hole in the same spot, but we also don't want to go above or below an old tap hole. We can go to the side. We don't want to go too close to the side of it. We want to go off, shift over a little bit and go up and down, as I'll show in another slide in a bit. But we definitely don't want to be right above or below. I think last time somebody asked about, can you tap like 12 inches above an old tap hole, and I would avoid, or 6 inches, I think somebody said. We want to be further than that. I would recommend at least 12 to 18 inches, but sometimes even more. So you don't even, usually want to be at least 3 feet above. So I recommend shifting over and up or down. I'll show that in a little bit. Here's just an example of what can happen. So here's this tap that's in. Here's an old tap hole right below here. And so this is actually a video, and you watch now. This is under vacuum. So this is putting vacuum onto a system, and this is what can happen when you're too close to these old tap holes. Besides impacting flow, as we'll see in a minute, it's also going to be a vacuum leak. And so as you watch and see all the air racing in through there, and then I put my thumb over the hole, so it's kind of blocking the air. So now it's slowing down. It's still too fast. It's still leaking in some air, but at least it's slowed down. And then I'll pull my thumb off, and you can see the air speeds in again. So that we do not want. That's a vacuum leak. That's going to lower our vacuum. Our production's is high, so we want to make sure we're away from those old tap holes. Because what happens is when we tap into a tree, trees have this ability, this kind of wounding mechanism. It's called compartmentalization. And what happens, and this is really happening kind of post maple sap flow season for the most part, is this compartmentalization where they're putting up these walls, these kind of barriers, and they block off and create this little vault of dead wood in the area where you tapped. So it's much like forming like scar tissue in the tree. And so within this blocked off compartmentalized area, it's going to actually put these walls around it and seal that off, and so that no sap will flow into that area. So it becomes what we call non-conductive wood. So it's not conducting, it's not transporting any sap. There's no sap moving through that portion of the wood. So it's non-conductive wood formation. And so if you tap into that area, you're not going to get any sap because there's no sap in there. And also, if you tap into that area, that's actually potentially to cause more damage in the tree, because the reason why they form this non-conductive wood is so that pathogens don't get into that tap hole and then be picked up and potentially spread around the tree, or any kind of fungal decays don't get in there and start to rot the tree, decay the tree. So they seal that off, and that sealing that they do, it's the width of the tap hole, as we can see in this figure here. That's pretty much the width, maybe a teeny bit wider on either side of the tap hole. And these are the old 7/16 tap holes, so these are a little bit wider. And then it goes above and below that tap hole, 8 to 10 inches typically, sometimes as much as 3 feet occasionally, especially on the older, larger tap holes. In this particular one right here, if we look at this tap hole, doesn't go up quite as high. Maybe that one's only 6 to 8 inches, whereas this one over here is probably about 12 inches on either side if we had a scale there. So that's also called the stain column, because it's a darker colored wood, a different colored wood that's there, that's formed. So again, you're not going to be able to get any sap from that area. But if we were to drill into that area, you're not going to get sap, but you're also kind of broke open to that wall, that sealed off area, and that can allow fungal pathogens that get in there then that can cause decay. That's going to rot and create a little cavity within there, and could potentially spread further within that tree. So we want to avoid that for the health of the tree, and also for maximizing our production. And also we don't want to impact vacuum, but also we want to make sure we're getting into the sap. Here's looking at the cross section, or the cookie of a tree. On the right hand side is again from the 7/16. So these are the larger, what was used to be the industry standard up until the probably the mid to late 90s, early 2000s. And on the left is from the more standard now 5/16 drill bits, 5/16 diameter tap holes that are within the tree. You can see that with the bigger ones are forming much larger wounds within the tree versus our small one. And some of these have kind of coalesced together here. That happens when you drill into some of the old non-conductive wood. They kind of blend together. So that was part of the problem. So it looks even worse. Notice, it's the width of the tap hole, the depth of the tap hole. You can even see the point on the drill bit on these smaller ones here. And then it's, again, going above or below 8 to 10 inches oftentimes or more. So smaller tap holes, one of that advantages is creating less wounding, which means that we have more areas to keep tapping into year after year. And so, but as each year as this tree is growing, it is putting on new growth rings. So in this particular case, on all of these, if we look here, there's a nice line. That's how wide the tree was when that drill bit was put in there. And this is either above or below the tap hole. We can actually see the open hole. On the one on the right, you can see part of the open cavity, kind of the actual tap hole. It's not that it's filling the tap hole in, it's the scarring that we're seeing above or below all these marks. And so the tree was that wide when this was tapped, but it's putting on new growth. If we look on the cookie on the right here, this tree was tapped when it was this wide. That was this scar kind of here. It put on new growth, and then it was tapped when it was this wide, but that wasn't enough. We didn't have enough, a couple inches of new growth to tap into, so it drilled into that old tap hole. And that can potentially happen, especially if you have slow growing trees, which where I am in Lake Placid, New York, and also in Nova Scotia, our trees don't grow very quickly. So we need to be really mindful of not tapping into these old areas that's going to impact our production. We want a couple inches of new growth. So the idea is, if you tap here, is if you shift around the tree, as you shift around, there's new growth that's putting on each year. And by the time we get back to where we started, there's going to be enough, new growth, a couple inches of new growth over top of that old growth, that old tap hole, for us to continue to tap into new healthy wood. And that's why we don't tap really small trees, because that wounding is going to be a greater proportion of the total living wood. But also, a smaller tree would be a smaller circle. We would go around really quickly, and there wouldn't be new areas to tap into unless we went way above or way below, but those can be hard to reach, or down in the snow. So that can be harder to do. So we need to be mindful of that when we're tapping our trees. How healthy is it? How quickly is it growing? So when we're tapping a tree, it's always good to look at the shavings that are coming out from the tree, from the drill bit. You should have nice kind of creamy white shavings like this. That means that you were into good healthy wood. If you got more brown or gray, or just kind of a darker tan colored shavings, you're getting into that compartmentalized area. And if 50% or more of those shavings are kind of that dark brown, gray, tan, then you probably want to think about maybe drilling a new hole into that tree. And depending on the tree, maybe maybe you shouldn't even tap that tree at all. Maybe it's not healthy enough, especially if you drill a new hole and it's a good wood. The first spot, you're just like, well, I wasn't being careful, but I was careful the second time, and I'm still getting that. It might not be a tree that you should be tapping year after year. You need to give it a break, or maybe it's a tree that needs to be removed from your forest at that time. So pay attention to your shavings. If you only 20%, or less than 50% were dark brown, depending on the tree, sometimes, your production is going to be less, but maybe it's best to just leave that how it is for the year. And you can always hopefully get a better tap hole next year if it's just you made a mistake and weren't paying attention. And so here's another thing about thinking about tapping. So moving around, I like to do more of a pattern tapping. You still need to be careful and paying attention to where you're tapping on the tree, making sure you're into new wood, but you're less likely oftentimes to hit kind of old compartmentalized wood if we're continuing in this pattern, shifting around the tree. And so as we see here, the pattern that I like to follow is to typically go left or right an inch or 2 inches of the previous tap hole, and then go up and down at least 12 to 18 inches. So I like to get this really big staggered pattern, so I'm not too close that it could be a vacuum leak, that I'm ways from that, but shifting over so that I'm into new healthy wood. So as we can just see in an example here, the 2016 tap was over on the side, 2017's way up there, 2018 was down here. And I guess I should point out that within our woods, every year when we are pulling the taps at the end of the season, we use a different color of paint each year, and we put a little dot of paint just below the tap hole. And so I know which years these were based on following the pattern, but also based on looking at the color. So it's really handy. So when I'm going out to tap, from a distance as I'm walking up to that tree, I'm already looking at where I need to go, where I'm going to be tapping that tree roughly. And I'm also looking up at the canopy to make sure it's a healthy tree. So this is nice to kind of look back and gauge that. You don't have to do this. You can look at the pattern, but it's good to look at old tap holes to see how are they, are they closing, or there's a new growth that's closing up over top of those old tap holes. So if you don't like the look of the paint in the trees in your woods, you don't have to, but it is handy if you don't mind doing that. If you are certified organic, they may or may not let you do that. So you should check with your certifying agency. So going back, we're staggering 2018, shifts over way up to 19, shifts over and down to 20, and then shifts over and way down to 2021, and then shifts over an inch or two and up to 2022. So we're getting this really nice kind of zigzag up and down staggering, but allows us to slowly move around the tree, so that by the time we come back over here, there should be enough new growth on those trees. So thinking about, I just put in here, 1.5 to 2 inches in depth. So how deep should we actually tap? And so there has been research, University of Vermont has looked at this, of how deep we should actually tap into the tree. And as you can see in the graphs here, that they're looking at, inch, inch and a quarter, inch and a half, inch and 3/4, 2 inches, 2 1/4, 2.5 inches. And they were making 1.5 inches as their 100%. So if they tapped all the way down to 1 inch, the yield for sap yield was, over 40% less sap. So it was definitely better to be at least 1.5 inches. But is it any better to go higher? And so 1 3/4, we're about a 20% increase, and we get up to 2 inches, and we're even a little bit better. Sorry, 1 3/4. If we look at the trend line here, we're probably about 18%, but we get to 2 inches, we're a little over 20% better sap production, sap yield than we are at 1.5 inches. And then once you get to 2 inches, it starts to kind of flatten out here. So there's really no advantage to going deeper than 2 inches typically into the tree, because you're not going to gain any more yields. You're getting past the kind of the active sap of wood, because the center of the tree, the deeper down wood, is not really transporting sap anyway. So there's no advantage to be deeper on that tree. That being said, there can be some reasons where maybe you want to go 1 3/4 and not 2 inches. And that could be if you have really slow growing trees that have been tapped for many years. If it's your first time tapping these trees, they've never been tapped before, you might as well go 2 inches. And this is considering the bark. So we're measuring from the bark. And so we can usually put a gauge. So this is a piece of 5/16 tubing that slips over top. You can put some tape on, there was in some of the other pictures. You can buy little discs that have a little set screw that stop at a point. And this is actually, the measurement here is more than 2 inches. So this is too deep. And it could be partially because that tubing's been worn off some. So from our stopper to the tip should be 2 inches, and that would be including our bark on this is 2 inches. And so if you have new trees you haven't tapped before, you might as well go a couple inches. But if your trees have been tapped for a long time and they're slow growing, it goes back to, this right here, where maybe we want to tap a little bit shallower because we don't want to run the risk of hitting old sapwood. So in my woods, I do go more about 1 3/4 because my trees have been tapped since 1965, many of them, and they're slower growing trees. And so I'm a little bit more conservative. I want to make sure I have all good, healthy, productive tap holes, and a little bit shallower is okay, but if I can keep good yield with good clean tap holes. The graph below is looking at the syrup yield, so with the sugars involved, and it's the same thing. So sugars don't matter on the depth at that level. So how many taps can we put into a tree? And I see there's a couple questions in the Q&A about what's the smallest tree that is safe to tap. And Megan saying I have a lot of young trees. How small is too small? So great questions. And so the industry recommendation is not to tap trees usually below 9 inches. Some people say 8, 9 inches. I believe organic certification agencies don't allow you to go below 9 inches in diameter at breast heights. That's at 4.5 feet off the ground. It should be 9 inches or greater for tapping into that. And so the reason why that is that it goes back to, as I said before, is making sure that that tree has, enough wood to continue tapping that tree year after year. That being said, it's really important too to think about how, how long do you plan to tap that tree? There's some people use the theory, they've got small trees but then they're going to go in and thin them out of their woods. I'm not crazy about that idea. But if you are knowing that you're probably only going to tap trees for 5 years and then nobody's going to be tapping, none of your, family wants to tap after that, then maybe it's okay to tap some smaller trees. It's not that you can't get sap. You can get sap from a 1-inch diameter tree as long as you don't drill out the other side of the tree. But if you do a, smaller, shallow hole, you can get sap from any size tree. It's more about, that you're creating a greater proportion of wounded wood for the total active sapwood in the tree on the smaller tree, but also can you tap that for year after year? So kind of getting a gauge of how healthy is that tree, how quickly is it growing, how active is the canopy. Sometimes within a forest, a tree that's maybe 9, 10 inches in diameter could be the same age as the 16 or 18-inch diameter tree that's right next to it, but it's been kind of suppressed. There's bigger trees are growing over top of it, and so it's really not growing. So if you go in and tap that, 9-inch tree or even 8-inch tree, it's not going to be growing really quickly to catch up unless maybe that was be able to be released. And so that is important to think about with that. Smaller trees are going to yield less sap. So maybe even you think, well, I'm going to cut it down in a few years anyways, but is it worth the material and the time that you're going to put into that tree to get just a smaller yield from those? So that is important to think about how actively growing are those trees. And then if we're, 9 inches or more, we can put 1 tap in those trees. The typical industry standard is that if a tree is 18 inches in diameter around, that you can do 2 taps. And so some people's rule of thumb is if you go up and if you wrap your arms around and bear hug the tree, if your hands touch on the other side, then 1 tap. But if your hands don't touch, as the tree's wider and your hands don't reach and touch, then you can do 2 taps. Now, for everybody's arm length's a little different, so that can depend. And when it comes to multiple taps, though, it's important to think about also if we're putting 2 taps. Now we're creating 2 wounds within that tree, right? And so now we have a tap hole on either side of the tree, and then we're slowly shifting around, and we're only going halfway around that tree before we have to have 2 inches of new growth when we get into where the original tap hole was on the opposite side. And so how quickly, again, is that tree growing? And so the bigger the tree, the longer it's going to take to work around that circle just halfway. So thinking about that. With vacuum systems, adding a second tap hole doesn't mean that you're going to double production. Sometimes it will not increase production. You may get the same production from 2 tap holes with vacuum, with good high vacuum, than you would with 1. Or maybe you'll only get 50% more, which can be beneficial. That can be great. One drawback is oftentimes when you have 2 taps on a tubing system, you oftentimes will walk by and forget and not see the second drop line on the other side, and that tree won't get tapped, and then that becomes an issue and a vacuum leak. So in my woods, I only do 1 tap on all of my trees. My other reason is, so the reason why I don't do it is because I'm doing vacuum. My trees are slow growing. Again, cold region, poor soil nutrients, much like in Nova Scotia. And then The other piece is my really big trees that I would maybe put 2 taps in are trees that have been tapped for many years and are older trees and are just kind of in a little bit of a decline. They're getting older and they're starting to age out. And so, you know, trees that are big and older don't usually grow that quickly. They're slowing down in their growth and activity. So that's not always true. If you got a nice yard tree, that can be different, but in a forest, that sometimes can be the case. But if you're doing buckets, it's worth putting a couple taps on some of your bigger trees. Um, so there's a question thrown out there. If you do tap a 9-inch tree, would it be smart to start with 1.5-inch tap hole depth? It shouldn't matter, especially if you're just first starting out tapping that. You know, you may not end up get a lot of as much sap deeper down, but it shouldn't matter at 9 inches. It's still okay. It shouldn't matter too much on going even the full 2 inches on that 9-inch tree. So good question. So again, just thinking about, will that tree produce enough sapwood to tap year after year? This one on the right here is comparison to my gloved hand there. It's, in my opinion, too small of a tree to be tapping in that sense. So when should we tap? There's a lot of different factors that we need to think about. And some of that is if we tap early enough, we want to make sure we tap early enough to catch the sap flows. But if we tap too early, the sugars are lower at that time of the year. It's kind of tough conditions in that you're dealing with more heavy, cold freezing. But also, if we tap too early, our tap holes can dry up at the end of the season, because when we tap into a tree, we're exposing that tap hole to whatever kind of microbes that are organisms that are within the air, the atmosphere, that might have been on that tapping bit, that can get into there or on our spouts, in our tubing lines, that can get into that tap holes. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but those microbes can get into that tap hole, and there's sugars, amino acids, different nutrients that those microbes love in that nice humid environment. So they'll grow inside that tap hole and they'll plug up the cells of the wood, and so that will restrict flow. And so if we tap too early, that's more time that that tap hole is open, exposed, and if you get a lot of freeze thaws, that can impact that flow. But if we do some good sanitation, as we'll talk about at the end, then that's less of an issue. But we want to make sure we get out there and tap the trees. We don't want to wait too long though, because then we might miss some sap runs. So what I tell people when it thinks about tapping is you need to think about, when's it typically going to thaw out, you're going to get your freeze thaw cycles. For me in my woods, it typically, sap flow now is going to start late February, early March generally. And so I want to make sure all of my trees are tapped by the end of February. And so the other factor I need to think about is, how many trees do I want to tap and how long is it going to take me to tap those? So for the 7,000 trees, I usually figure that it's going to take us about 4 weeks to tap all those trees sometimes. If we get some cold days in there or heavy snowfalls where it's harder to get out there. Not every day I'm out there because there's other activities I need to do, but usually I have my crew start tapping kind of late January, early February, to make sure we, have plenty of time. We can still set up some of the research projects I need to do that. So, if sap's typically going to start flowing in March 1st in your woods, and it's going to take you only 2 weeks, and start in the middle of February. But if it's going to only take you a day, you're tapping 10 trees, that's easy. You look at the weather. All right, it's going to warm up tomorrow. It's probably going to be good sap flow. I'm going to go tap the trees today, or I'll go start tap them in the morning because I don't have as many to do. It's when you get many trees that you need to start planning out a little bit more. It's really important at the end of the season to untap your trees. Let that tap hole dry out. We don't want to shove any sticks or mud or anything into the tap hole or anything to block it off. Let the tap hole dry out. If you had a cut on you, you don't want to shove some dirty mud or sticks on top of that, right? So let the tree just heal on its own and let it dry out. You may still get a little bit of sap dripping potentially if the tap hole hasn't plugged up or dried out yet, but that's okay. So we need to allow that tree to kind of heal, unlike this picture on the left here where this old metal spout's left in that tree and the tree's starting to swallow it. Not that that's necessarily going to harm the tree, but it's always good to get out there and pull your taps. Um, so there's lots of different spouts or spiles or taps that we have out there that you can use. The ones on the right here are all for buckets. The one in the bottom right is a 7/16, so you still can get these out there, or you'll find used ones all over the place. So that is a 7/16. This is a 5/16 style that has the hook on it, but that one is a little bit narrow for 5/16. This one's a 5/16 metal one that the bucket would hang over, and this kind of catches it so the bucket doesn't slide off. Then all these other ones are for tubing, different size tubing, some of them, different styles, different diameters, different materials. There's lots of different theories. I'm not going to get into all of it today. A lot of it's just personal opinion on what do you like in your system, what that you're doing, that for the type of spout you'll be using. Most of these are all 5/16 diameter. This one is a 1/4 inch or a little bit smaller diameter tubing. Some of these, these two here are for 3/16 tubing, but 3/16 tubing still uses a 5/16 diameter spout traditionally, although you can get smaller ones. This one, the bottom left, has a little check valve ball. That's to prevent, if you think about last time we talked about trees, when they go into that freezing, they go into that vacuum mode. And so if you have a spout with tubing and there's sap in that spout and that tubing, it can actually suck some of that sap back up into the tree. And if there's microbes, as we just talked about, in that tubing, it can pull that back into the tree and more likely to contaminate that tree and not flow as well. And so this little ball here prevents that sap from flowing back, and can be effective for keeping that contaminated sap if your drop line is not clean. If you got a nice clean tubing line, you don't have to worry about that so much. All right, I threw the poll everywhere up here again. So if you want to throw out this question for folks, and the question here, so those, just a reminder, or for those who weren't on the lecture last time, if you pull out your phone, a text message into the number 37607, in the body of the message, type Adam Wild 676, send that, and then you should get a response right away that says you're logged in, and then you can answer just A, B, or C for the answer here. Or you can scan the QR code. It'll take you to a web for doing it easily on the web. So the question here is asking about the picture of this tree on the right here. So it's not a very, we're not seeing much on the tree here, but just based on the tree here and some of the stuff we maybe just talked about, is this tree healthy? Should we be tapping it? So yes, tap away. No, or sorry, B is, it's not great. Maybe I need to be just a little careful with tapping that tree. Or C is no, that tree's not worth tapping at all, and I should move on. So go ahead and send in your answer. And then if you've got any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and Caitlin can jump in. We'll just pause for a second here too, or throw it in the Q&A, and I can try to answer any questions before we move on to the next. All right, I'm going to start showing the responses. Hopefully these don't influence your choice, but. Whoop. All right, looks like everybody's gonna go put in their two thoughts. So majority of people said not great. I should be careful when tapping. If you want, go ahead, throw in the Q&A why you think that might be. We said 25% yes, tap away, 13% no, move on to a different tree. So there's a question from Megan saying, I have trees that are growing multiple trunks. Do I treat each trunk as a separate tree? That's a great question, Megan. Thanks for bringing that up. My answer, my philosophy with that is, if that tree is splitting off into multiple stems below kind of my waist level, and meaning that there's those, I will treat those trees as separate kind of stems. So, if I can reach and I have separate, basically a stem that I can get all the way around that tree, then I will put a tap in each of those separate stems. Whereas if it splits, at more head height, then I'm probably not going to be able to reach, around all those different stems. So I'll treat that as one tree typically. But if it's, splits lower to the ground and I can get around, sometimes though, if they split, but they're kind of smashed together a little bit and you can't really get around, to think about how much surface area is there to continue to tap it around. Because if half of the tree is, you can't tap into that wood because it's bumping up against the other stem next to it, then maybe you want to treat that as one. It'll, depend on how much surface area is there to tap into. So that's the thing about as well. So great question. All right, so moving to the our example here. Obviously, this is maybe a little bit hard to tell. Is this tree healthy or not? And so the things that we want to be looking for, so I didn't necessarily say this before, but what we want to be looking at is looking at these tap holes. And there's several tap holes that we see here. There's different paint marks, and obviously you don't know how old these are based on the paint, but if I'm out tapping the woods, I should know what those different colors, what years they represent. We do have some overlapping colors here. There's a green just over on the side here, but there's several tap holes. And what I'm looking for is that I'm seeing that these tap holes, all of them have a fairly round, they're all still fully round, which means that there's not a lot of new growth growing over top of that old tap hole. And that, if there's not a lot of new growth, it's not closing up. This one, you kind of see that there is a little bit of closure, but that's a really old tap hole. That tap hole is probably at least 5 years old, and it's only closed from, and it's hard to tell in this picture, but I can kind of see that there's some walls coming on either side that only 50%. And so a tap hole should be closing within 2 to 3 years for you. And, then it should start where you can't even really tell that it's a circle. It'll start to stretch, the bark will split open, so it's not a perfectly round circle. But if it's a perfectly round circle and that's 3, 4, 5 years old, and you can easily, stick a pencil in there or something, then that tree is not putting on a lot of new growth and probably should not be tapped. So if we look more at the tree, if we actually look up, we'll see that this tree is actually, the canopy split right out of this tree. So with that in mind, obviously you didn't have this information. So good to always look up at the canopy of the tree before you tap it to make sure that it's a healthy tree. But also looking at these old tap holes to see, because maybe the canopy looks okay, but are these tap holes closing? It's great to look back at that as well. So here's an example of what, a more healthy tree, what this should look like is that, here's a tap hole. We can see the round curvature on either side, same down here on the bark, but the bark is split open as the tree, and the wood on the inside has put on layers. So that's where we get all the ridges on bark, because the inside of the tree, the layers are forming in the xylem. And so that splits that open. And then the holes, there's wood that's closed completely over top of that old hole. So you can't, stick a piece of wire or anything into there. Even these more recent ones here are, this green one's completely closed. This yellow one, it's a little bit harder to see there, but that's only a couple years old and it's completely closed. Here's another example, this little picture here. It's on a smoother bark tree. It still has a nice circle on the outside where the bark hasn't split, because it's a kind of a younger tree with a smoother bark, but it's completely closed up on the inside. So that's, great tap hole closure, even though it's still round out there. So we want to look at those old tap holes. So hopefully that helps you understand that. So moving on, if you do have more questions about tapping, feel free to throw them in the Q&A, or we can answer them later. But if we want to move on now and think about our collection system options, in that, we can use buckets hanging from a tree, we can have tubing, or we can have tubing with vacuum. And there's a couple different forms of vacuum that we'll go over. So these are, our standard collection systems. And when we're talking about buckets, there's kind of some different avenues within that as well. So the advantages of having buckets it's that it's really simple. It's fairly inexpensive to get started in. You might, have some around, or a friend that has some, or some other, maybe not metal buckets like this, but some other food grade containers that you can use. The aesthetics can be really pleasing. It's really nice to see that hanging, on the tree. It just has that image that's kind of iconic for the maple industry. So, if you are doing tubing, it's sometimes great just to have buckets hanging from trees near your sugar house because people like seeing that. Um, it allows you to, understand the trees individually, so it really gives you a up close glimpse of, you know, did I get good wood? Did I hit good wood on this tree, or is this just a poor performing tree? How's the sap flow on it? Whereas with a tubing system, you don't get that idea on an individual tree by tree basis. You can know in your whole woods, but it's hard to know how each tree is performing. Where here you can even measure the sugar and see which ones are sweeter, which might be better then in the future. Tap your sweeter trees if you're choosing between tapping a few trees, but not all the trees. But the disadvantage is it's super labor intensive during, really poor mud conditions again. Remember maple season, we said last time, it's the mud season. So during these poor conditions, when it's your busiest time, you're trying to collect sap and boil it. There's a lot to do. And so it takes the most amount of labor at that time, and these roads are all muddy. So that's the biggest drawback to that, is the amount of labor that it takes. And another thing I want to point out about buckets is, so this bucket that I have in the image here, this is an aluminum bucket. This is great, okay to be used, but these old galvanized metal buckets, unfortunately, are not allowed to be used anymore for sap collection to come in contact with the sap. You can use the galvanized lids on the aluminum buckets because that's not going to come in contact with the sap. But a lot of times why we don't use these old galvanized buckets anymore, the main reason is a lot of them are soldered on the bottom with lead solder. And that can get into the sap, or does get into the sap. Especially sap can sometimes be a little bit acidic, so it's more likely to break that down than what water would. I'm gonna pick up the lead. You can also get high levels of zinc, but the lead's the big issue. And you think about, well, what's can't be that bad. It can't be that much. But what do we do with sap? We boil it down and we concentrate it 40 plus times, and so that lead is just going to be concentrating, and that's not boiled off. And so, do not recommend using, in an industry standard, you're not allowed to be using these anymore. That being said, that doesn't mean, go throw them out. There is value. People will buy these for decorations and things. Or what I tell people, use some kind of plastic liner. Get yourself a 3 gallon bag or 5 gallon bag or something, plastic bag that you can put in the inside and kind of fold it over the top a little bit and put your lid on top. And then, you can still use that as the structure to hang from the tree. You get that iconic image. And then you can just pour that out, and you can keep that bag even just in there. If you need to swap it out throughout the season, you can. So that's what I recommend to people who do want to use those, is just do a plastic liner bag on the inside. You could even do a compostable bag if you want. That should probably hold up for most of the season. And as I said, there's things that you can use that, you might have laying around that you don't have buckets or you don't want to buy. You've got some water jugs. I wouldn't necessarily recommend milk jugs just because it's hard to get that milk out. So anything that, may have been a food product, but is there still that smell or flavor that's in that container, in that plastic, because plastic is porous. Things get into it. And so that can be spread into the sap, and then we concentrate it, so then you have off flavors. Even sometimes glass containers I've had, I remember one time put maple syrup into some old jars that had pasta sauce in it, tomato sauce, and I felt like I could still taste a little bit of tomato in there, even though it was glass, which was kind of odd. But so make sure, do the sniff test, make sure it seems okay. Lots of creative things. You want them to look fancy, you can have some nice glass bottles hanging from there. Or you can just have some buckets hanging or sitting on the ground with a short piece of tubing coming off a spout. That could be an option. If you're in a windy area, you may want to wire these to the tree. If you got lots of snow still, the snow will kind of hold them in place. But if the buckets are empty, they can blow around, or put a rock or brick on top or something like that. There are plastic buckets that can hang from the tree as well. but the biggest thing is just making sure that your containers are food grade. Also think about what's the image that you have. So these orange buckets are food grade typically. So usually if you buy buckets, they may say food grade. A lot of times anything that's usually in the #2 recycle plastic, or has that symbol, the #2 for recycling, is usually a food grade plastic. Um, but it's good to check and make sure that, where you're buying a bucket from, that it is a food grade. But, so these are food grade, but is it, how does that look? Is that the image you want? Maybe it is, maybe it's not, of having a bunch of orange buckets out there. But definitely you want to make sure you're not using an old paint bucket or old sheetrock bucket or something, even if it was originally food grade, that it didn't have, that had something in it that was not food grade. If you're trying to sell syrup and right outside your sugar house is a bucket collecting sap from a kitty litter bucket, and all those scents that are in kitty litter, that's going to get into your sap. But what's that image? How does that look? If you have a sheetrock bucket that's there, how does that going to look to the customers? They're probably not going to want to stop and buy your syrup from you. So important. Remember, this is a food product, but also think about how does that look to your customers as well. You can do these bags. You can buy these holders. The holders are usually around the $15 a piece, so they're not all that cheap. The bags can be washed and reused, or you can throw them out at the end of the year. I've heard of cases of these blowing off in the wind too. You got to be careful. But it is an option. Some people like them. Usually the holders you lift right off, and then you just can easily dump the bag and hang it back up. So they're kind of handy. You can make your own holders if you don't like. It is important to have a lid over your sap though, to keep the water out, keep the bugs out. But definitely the water, we have to remove enough water in processing. We don't want to have to remove more water. You can use kind of some old wine bags or buy these wine bags. This is too many taps in a tree, but it is a nice big yard tree. But there's lots of different ways you can be creative. When it comes to sap collection, remember that, again, how we're, making sure we have good roads so we don't get stuck or tearing up the roots around our trees. For driving through our woods in that mud season and we're disturbing the soil, disturbing the roots. Roots spread a long ways on a tree, especially within the forest. So we want to be careful on that, whether we're using draft horses or we'll call the dump lines. I think I mentioned this the other day. This is this old picture, but you can still create, if you had a hill that maybe you're doing buckets on the hillside or at the top of the hill, but your collection's down below, you can't get up there to collect it easily, but you still want to do buckets. You could have, a short piece of tubing going down maybe from a little tank or a bucket or something, or a funnel like this that you can go dump the sap into, and it goes down into a little tank in the back of your ATV or something. There's ways you can get creative to not be hauling sap or a sled down the hill, or you're going to tip it and or you're going to fall or hurt yourself or spill all your sap. The worst case is, to get going down a steep slope and you slip and dump that sap and you lose that product. So all things to think about, making sure we're avoiding creating muddy roads. So again, much like in our buckets, we want to make sure we have clean food grade collection tanks. These tote boxes like in the middle, a lot of times you can pick those up fairly cheap or even free sometimes from food manufacturers. But again, be careful of what was in there. If there's, it could have been a food product, but if it was maybe some kind of like thick fruity syrup for a beverage or something like that, that's cherry syrup for a soda or something like that, that's usually going to stay in there and probably not going to get out very easily. So there's a lot of tanks you can repurpose from dairy industry and different things that might be out there. So you can find different tanks. You typically want to have around 2 gallons of storage per tap within your woods. That's a good rule of thumb. At least 1 gallon, somewhere 1 to 2 gallons, but some of that's going to depend on your kind of lifestyle. If you're working all day and you're not going to be able to collect that sap till the end of the day or the next day or something, you want to make sure that you have enough storage capacity to hold the amount of sap that would come on your heaviest days so that you don't overflow your tanks. And oftentimes it's a good idea to filter your sap before you boil it down. And so different ways you can do that. If you're collecting in buckets, a nice simple way is to buy these paint strainers. They usually fit right over top of a 5-gallon bucket that you may be using for hauling your sap. And so it's a nice, just fine mesh that just to get the bugs, the sticks, the leaves, the bark out of there. So that's a good option. Coffee filters are a simple, cheap system. They don't work well for filtering syrup, but for sap, they work well. You can get these felt filtering bags that can go over top of a pipe, maybe if it's as it's flowing into your tanks, or there's commercial filters, felt filters that you can pump sap through in a larger scale. So there's a question from Megan about how cool for storage and how long. So that's a great question that gets into this next point. So great timing. So sap is biologically active. It can spoil. So when you think about sap, think about it much like milk in a way. You know, you wouldn't keep milk sitting outside on a 50-degree day, or 50-degree Fahrenheit. Sorry, I'm thinking Fahrenheit because we're behind things in the US. So I guess in Celsius. So if you were somewhere around with 10 degrees, 10, 20 degrees, you know, you wouldn't want milk sitting out for 2, 3 days, or maybe even not a day at that temperature, because there are microbes either in our got into our that are in our tubing system or in our tanks or in our buckets, depending on how we're tapping and collecting that sap. If that sits there, that sap is going to be the microbes are going to be growing that, and that can spoil our sap. The warmer it is, the more likely that you're going to get more of this biological activity, these microbe activity, this fermentation that can even happen. A little bit of that is okay. We'll go over this in our next presentation when we get into talking about syrup production. A little bit of that fermentation is good, but we don't want too much of it because that can spoil, that gives off flavors, especially if it depletes all the oxygen in your sap. Then you start to get more kind of sulfury anaerobic. So you get anaerobic microbial activity. So think about swamps that are anaerobic, so no oxygen, and you get that sulfury smells in swamp water, pond water. You can get that same in your sap, and it's going to be there in your finished syrup. So it's not going to taste great at all. So warmer weather, you're going to spoil faster. Especially at the end of the temperature, when we're end of the season, we're dealing with warmer temperatures, but also the end of the season, our microbe population in our tubing or our buckets and our tanks, if we haven't cleaned them much, is going to have more of that microbes kind of within each of those applications. And so we're going to get more of that spoilage. And so this picture on the left here, this sap draining out of this valve, see how cloudy, kind of milky that is? That's a first indication that that's probably not great, although cloudy sap can sometimes be okay. But this real milky looking, but also this is super thick. It's maybe hard to tell from this image, but if you just look at here, that on these nice dry leaves, if this was maple sap, it would just, you know, it should be infiltrating right down in through the leaves into the soil. Instead, it's this big blob. This had sap that had been sat for quite a while in a little container out in the woods for a research project that I had. And it had a lot of that spoilage and became what we call ropey. And that would make extremely ropey syrup as well, which means that it's this thick, kind of snotty, stringy. So it's called ropey because if you grab the hold of that with your hands and kind of, you can actually pick up on it and it'd be like this long, stringy slime. And instead of being like water. And so when it comes to how long can you actually store it, it's really, there's not a short answer to that or an exact answer because it just depends on what the temperature is, how contaminated that sap was when it came in. So, you know, early in the season when weather's cooler, you can probably keep sap for, you know, 3, 4, maybe even 5 days, 6 days, and it'll probably be okay. Late in the season, you probably can't keep it more than 24 hours, 48 hours. If you can keep it cold, the better, you know, it is. The cooler it is, the better that's going to be. What I recommend to people who are smaller scale producers, who are tapping with buckets and also probably less likely to be able to get to that sap, you know, as often, or maybe they can collect it each day, but they're not going to be able to boil it. They're more of the weekend boilers, the weekend warriors that are collecting the sap maybe throughout the week, but saving it. Maybe they do a boil once or twice a week during the week, but are doing most of their boiling on weekends. So if you don't have a lot of sap, what I recommend is throughout the winter, try to build up a good snow pile on a like east facing, north facing side of your house or garage or barn or something where that snow pile is less likely to melt as quickly. It's going to stay cold, and then you can kind of, pile your sap into there, dig a little area to set the sap into the snow, or a little tunnel kind of to put your buckets into, or a small little, tanks that you might have to kind of build the snow around those to keep that sap cooler. Try not to keep it out in the sun. If you can get it into a cooler, garage or barn, that could be better, where maybe on some cold concrete where it's not as warm, it's out of the sun, or into a basement. Any of those things would be better options. Don't have, your sap tanks out in the middle of the sun, or your buckets. Get that out of the sun. Keep it as cool as possible to help keep it last a little bit longer. If you can boil part of it, maybe you can't boil it all the way down. Maybe you boil in the middle of the week, you don't get all the way, but you can kind of reduce the volume, or you can use reverse osmosis and save some of that and be able to put it into like a cooler, a fridge or something that you can fit it all in, is a great option as well. So that's what I used to do when I was boiling on a stovetop. I would kind of cook it down as far as I could each night and then build up, keep it in the fridge, and then finish it on the weekends. All right. All right, so another question for you. Take a quick break. If you got any questions, you can throw in the Q&A box, but a question for you right on the poll everywhere. So again, you don't have to type in my name into the 37607, just that number. You can answer either of these questions. How do you plan to collect sap this coming season? Do you plan to use buckets, or type in, so A, B, C, or D? You can just type into the message. Buckets, tubing with vacuum pump, tubing with a gravity, vacuum, or tubing without vacuum. And Yannick said you can make maple jujubes, which I'm not sure I know what that is. So do you know what those are, Caitlin?
Yeah, jujubes. They're like the little candies, like gelatin candies.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
It
I
must be a
would.
Canadian thing.
It must be a Canadian. I've never heard that term before, so it must be Canadian or Nova Scotian. Um, is that a maple candy, or is that like more like gummy bear type things?
No, they're more like gummy bear type things, but yeah, they're not typically maple flavored, but
Okay, gotcha. That's interesting, and I learned something too tonight. That slimy sap though, I would not recommend making those out of that either. The flavor, besides being slimy, the flavor is not great at all either. All right, so here's responses. Looks like 63% of you are planning buckets, 13% tubing with vacuum, 13% tubing with gravity vacuum, and 13% tubing without vacuum. So great to see that, what people are actually thinking. So there's not any other questions. I'm going to move into tubing. So most of you are thinking about buckets, but it's good to kind of, have this idea of tubing. Tubing might seem kind of daunting, and maybe that's why you're thinking about buckets, but it's really not all that hard. What I even like to tell people is, maybe you're still going to use buckets, but instead of having, 5 individual trees that you go to, maybe you do a short run of tubing that captures 5 trees and flows into one bucket, or flows into a little, tank or garbage can type of thing, or something that, instead of walking all 5 trees or 3 trees, some of those can flow into one bucket. So you don't have to go walk into each individual tree. It's one collection point, and then you got another 5 trees that you do that or something. So it is something to think about, or maybe in the future as you grow, you may want to do some tubing. And so tubing is, heavy in labor and a bigger, expense, your first year of putting it out, but once you have it, it saves you labor and capital, over the life of the system once it's out there. And it has the potential to increase sap production as well. And so that's also the other big advantage, but definitely saves labor in the commercial maple, people who are tapping, several thousand trees. There's no way that, the 7,000 trees that I'm tapping now, I'm doing that with 3 people. There's no way we could do that with 3 people with buckets. But we can manage, that, and that's with all the research. 7,000 trees could be managed by 2 people easily. So let's just think about the components quick. I won't spend tons of time. If people have more questions about tubing, certainly you can reach out. I'll show you some references. I also did a presentation on tubing design and installation for the maple producers in Nova Scotia. So I believe that's recorded on the Perennia website as well. So you can refer to that as well. Some of these are the same concepts, but I went into more depth there. So starting out a tree, obviously we have our spout. Then we have a section of tubing coming off of that that's usually about 3 feet long. And that's what we call our drop line. In the off season, we kind of cap that off onto our T. So the T is where the drop line comes down and connects into what we call our lateral line. So at the end of the line, it does a loop around the tree and then comes down and connects. So we connect a few trees typically together on one lateral line. So if you were just wanting to put a few trees together and have it go into a bucket, you would just have a lateral line with individual drops, a T fitting that would go to your spout, a little short section of tubing into a spout on your lateral line. Your lateral lines come down, and if you are doing a bigger system, they're going to tie into a larger tubing line, which we call our main line. And they're going to come in, and where our main line, we actually suspend our main liner because it's bigger, it's heavier, and we want to make sure we have pitch. We suspend that main line from a piece of wire. So it's held up from wire that's held tight, anchored from tree to tree. And then the tubing's held from that. We have a little hook connector that holds the lateral line onto the wire. So it's putting all the tension, and we can pull really tight on that lateral. That's what helps hold it up. It's anchored around the tree at the end, and then it's tight around that wire. So it stays up between all the trees, stays off the ground. Then has a little loop that comes into what we call a manifold or a saddle. That's just the connection point. Manifold just means a connection point where that lateral line comes into our main line. And as I mentioned, these main lines are suspended with this high tensile wire. Then there's little pieces of wire that attach the main line to the wire that we have there. And here's another type of saddle. There's that hook connector. You can see where that's hooked around the piece of wire there. So the tension's pulling back this way. That way it doesn't put any tension onto the saddle or manifold here. All the tension's on the wire, because if not, there's a little gasket here. So this white piece is a gasket. That's what helps seal it. If we were putting tension on this, it would maybe pull that to the side, and that would not have a nice tight seal, and it could be an air leak. So we want to put the tension on the wire and then just have this nice gentle loop that brings the sap into our main line. Our main lines can branch off. We usually call those spur main lines. If they're, if it's a branch going off into a different area, and they might branch off multiple times, and oftentimes they do. And then obviously our main lines feed all the way back down to our collection point and into our sap tanks, transporting that sap. All of your tubing should be on at least a 2% slope. So everything pitches, everything drains back down into your collection tanks. And so just thinking about just a brief layout, if you are thinking about designing and putting out a tubing system, there are people you can hire to come do it for you, or definitely it's not that difficult to do it yourself. What I recommended is to go to, if you can go visit a neighboring sugaring operation or somewhere nearby, just kind of walk through the woods. Once you kind of see the components, you'll understand that it's really not too bad. It might look daunting at first, but if you just kind of look at each individual component and get an idea, it's not too bad. So if we are laying out a system, one place to start, you can go out and walk your woods, but just looking at a topography map can help understand. So in this area, we have these topography lines, a little faint, but we can see that these are all essentially little valleys here. So we don't want too much pitch on our tubing. So we want at least 2%, but we also don't want it to go really, really steep, because we want our sap to be running along the bottom of our main lines and then there's going to be air flowing across the top if we're using a vacuum system, but we don't want it charging down. We also don't want to go from steep to a shallow pitch really quickly. That's where sap will pool up. So we want a nice kind of river or stream trickling along the bottom, and then room for air in the top. So in this case, this design, there could be different ways you do it, but I'm going to run this main line. We also call the main section the conductor line, coming out, staying along the bottom of this hill, kind of wrapping around, and it's going to capture here. And in this case, at the end, we can drop down to a smaller size because there's less trees going into it. And then in all these gullies, we'll have these spur main lines that go up into these little gullies. So staying in our low points, and then off of those spur main lines, we can run all of our laterals that are going to connect to our individual trees, as I drew in some of the trees up here. So individual laterals running to each of our trees. So that's one simple way to lay out that tubing. And here's another example on a different parcel. Here we don't quite have the gullies. There's kind of a low spot here, but in this particular case, you might be tempted to just run the tubing straight up away from your sap house or your sugar house, sugar camp. And that could work, but that's where that pitch is going to get a little bit steeper. It's also going to be harder to work within that woods. If we went just straight up or kind of fan this out, it's kind of not as easy to work in that woods. So actually the way I would run this is kind of loop around, making this big kind of C shape sort of on our main conductor line. And then these lines that kind of angle up the hill, but are kind of going more across the side hill on some slight angles. And the reason I would do this more, and then again, our laterals, if you notice, all my laterals are just coming off of one side in this case. So they're coming and feeding down, even though, if there's a tree here, you could potentially grab it, but this is on the downhill side of that line. And the reason why I would keep them all on the uphill side, if possible, is access. It's important to think about, or it's great to think about access within our tubing system. And so in this case, it's easy to either walk or even drive an ATV or something, or snowmobile down along here to get down to do any repairs instead of having to walk or carry things. So it's easy to get in here. We don't have any of the lateral lines in our way. It's also just easy to walk, and we have access all the way around the woods here too. So access is really important to think about. When people first started putting up tubing, it was kind of tubing means we don't have to go out in the woods and collect buckets, so it doesn't really matter, right? But it is important to have access because you still want to get out there and do work. You have trees that fall in the lines, you're going to have to go cut those off. You need to haul that tubing out there. Here's a picture of this old roadway. It's kind of grown up because you can't really use it because all these lines cross it. This is actually in my woods. We're actually working on changing this year. And so somebody had set this up. So what we're going to do is instead put this line on the uphill side of the road. And so all the lines would come down there. I mean, they're not doing anything going across the road really much anyways. There's a lot of just empty space for running tubing where there's no trees across that roadway. That would open up this road. And then the trees on the right-hand side, we can have a separate line capturing those trees. Keep your roads open. If you do need to cross the roadway, try to keep it high if possible. Here we come high and then it kind of drops down, but it's kind of a gradual kind of slopes. It doesn't form a tight angle. It slopes down here to a lower pitch then as it drops down. That's an option. If you can't go high, another option is to go under the road through some culverts. We did this in our woods. This has been really a game changer that opened up, allowed us to go across these roads any time of the year to go access anything. I see there's a couple questions. Steve made a comment that he did buckets for years, but a friend convinced me to use tubing. It was a game saver, not as daunting as it looks. Major labor saver plus increased yield, win-win. So thanks for that comment, Steve. So we have somebody confirming that. Richard asked, do we need to replace your lines and main lines? The answer is that usually your main lines can last somewhere 20 to 30 years, typically we say. Your lateral lines are usually good for 10, 15 to 20 years, sometimes can be more. And they can usually sometimes last longer than that. Sometimes you just want to change things up a little bit because some trees have died off and you maybe want to go in and thin, or you decide you want to run the system a different way. But they can last quite a while. They're not forever, typically, but they can last quite a long time. There's UV protection in the tubing, so that doesn't impact it, so it doesn't degrade or anything like that. So the tubing does last a long time. And you don't need to take it down every year. You can leave it up. All right, so as I mentioned, our tubing, our main line is going to hang from wire. We're going to use that. You want to make sure you have a good high tensile wire with a good high tensile strength so it can carry all the weight, and you can pull tight on that. Usually use a 12.5 gauge or 9 gauge. If you want a little bit thicker, a lot of people are switching more to a 9 gauge. It's just less likely to break, but it is a higher cost. So if you're doing a smaller system, 12.5 gauge works well. That's what I did for years. I'm doing more 9 gauge now. I like the 9 gauge, but it does have some more costs and it's a little bit harder to work with. So you can string that up, you can get a spooler, and this is usually anchored from tree, and it might go somewhere from 200 to 500 feet that you're going to run that. And then you can anchor it using one of these wire strainers, that ratchet strainers, that's then on a loop around a tree. We use some old tubing to protect the tree. If you don't have any old tubing, find somebody who's been sugaring for a while. They'd probably have some that they'd be happy to give you or let you use. Notice that it's this big loop, so we have extra tubing, and that I don't have this anchor, this ratchet strainer way close to the tree, where as that tree grows, this loop is way out here that allows that wire to kind of expand, to spread out, so there's room for that tree to grow and it's not going to girdle the tree. You can put an anchor into the tree. I'm less of a fan of these, but I have a colleague who really likes the anchors in the tree. So it depends on, everybody has their own opinion. You are putting a wound in the tree, but you're not going to girdle the tree. Even the tree grows into it, it's not going to girdle it. But I've also seen many times where the tree, rots as dead wood in that area, and those rip out of the tree, or the tree swallows into it. But it is a possibility. So how do we anchor the wire at the end? So we saw the wire strainer. Another option is a gripple. You can buy these from maple supply companies or fence supply companies. It's like has an opening on either end that the wire passes through. If you pass through one side, it won't allow you to pull back, and then you pass another piece of wire through a hole on the other side, and so it's like a Chinese finger lock that you can't pull back on it, but you keep moving it forward, and there's a tool to even tighten it. You can do these wire crimps. These are a cheaper option. Sometimes they haven't always worked for me though. Sometimes they pull through. I'm less of a fan of them. They're a little bit more cumbersome to work with. Or another option is to do these wire splices, which is what a lot of people are doing now, especially with a 9 gauge wire, where you pull the wire really tight with a come along ratchet strainer here there's these grips that hold on to the wire. It pulls it tight, and then you do this splice wrap around, and that then you release it, and it holds there really well. It's important to think about protecting a tree, as I said, making sure we have good, good tubing,